The thermal cameras said the corridor was empty. The motion sensors said 4 heat signatures were closing in from both directions at once. Both readings came from the same equipment at the same second. The thermal cameras said the corridor was empty. Staff Sergeant Tobias Cade stared at his handheld readout twice, then a third time before he said anything at all. For heat signatures, moving fast, closing from both directions of a corridor that motion sensors confirmed held nothing but stagnant air. He didn't like being the one to say it first. He said it anyway, voice flat. Something's wrong with the data, or something's wrong with the corridor. 6 hours earlier, none of this had existed. An experimental high-altitude recovery drone, called Sign Horizon 4, had gone dark over Adak Island, its transponder pinging once from 300 meters below ground before falling silent. The Aleutian station above it had been closed since 1989, its hangars sealed, its runways cracked under decades of frost heave. Master Sergeant Renata Duval's team of the 24th Special Tactics Squadron had been tasked with one job: retrieve the flight recorder before weather or curiosity beat them to it. The tasking order itself had been strange, routed through a DOE liaison desk rather than the usual recovery chain, time-stamped and reprioritized twice within an hour of the drone's last signal. Duval had flagged the anomaly to her group commander before wheels up and received only a terse confirmation that the mission profile stood as briefed. She'd learned long ago that the fastest way to lose a mission was to keep questioning who'd written it. Dr. Priya Anand had arrived with them, DOE credentials and a hard case chained to her wrist, saying almost nothing on the flight in. Duval didn't like attachments she couldn't read. She liked them even less when they flinched at coordinates on a map they hadn't been briefed on. The insertion had gone clean. A Pave Hawk dropped them a click from the old runway, rotor wash scattering 40 years of undisturbed snow. Technical Sergeant Marcus Thorne walked point up the access road, joking about frostbite until his breath started fogging too fast for comfort. Staff Sergeant Silas Okafor brought up the rear with the medical ruck, counting steps out of habit, the way he always did before something went wrong. The walking gave them their first real look at the station. 3 collapsed radar domes, a row of barracks with windows boarded from the outside rather than the inside, and a perimeter fence still hung with a faded warning placard nobody bothered to translate for the new arrivals. Cade snapped a photo of it anyway, some instinct telling him command would want the wording on file. Duval kept the pace brisk. Weather on Adak turned without warning, and she wanted the recorder bagged before the wind did. They found the hangar door already open, not forced, not frozen shut like every other structure on the island. Open and recently. Inside, the crash site told half a story. Horizon 4's airframe was crumpled against a support pillar, but its flight recorder housing was empty, the mounting bolts sheared clean rather than torn. Someone or something had removed it deliberately. Frost had already crept over half the fuselage, but the panel around the missing housing was bare, as if whatever had opened it had lingered there long enough to melt the rime with body heat alone. Sheared, not ripped, Thorne said, running a gloved finger along the exposed metal. That's tool work. Duval circled the wreck twice, boots crunching over scattered fuselage panels, and found no blood, no obvious struggle, nothing to suggest the drone had been brought down by force. It had simply landed badly, and something had come for it afterward with a patience that unsettled her more than violence would have. Cade's sensor package chirped an irregular pattern. He frowned at it, tapped it, frowned harder. There's a stairwell under the hangar floor that's not on any base schematic I've got. He pulled a partial data dump from Horizon 4's damaged onboard memory instead, scrolling through corrupted telemetry until one line resolved clean. The drone had altered its own flight path in its final minutes, descending toward the hangar under a command Cade couldn't trace to any operator on record. It didn't crash here, he said slowly. It came here, on purpose, like it was called. Duval crouched at the hatch. Cold air breathed up from below, carrying a mineral smell like wet iron. Anand, talk to me, now. The scientist's jaw tightened around a non-answer. I'm here to secure the recorder. That's the full scope of my briefing. Duval didn't believe her and didn't have time to argue it. She keyed her radio, confirmed overwatch with the pilot circling above, and told her flatly to hold station and log the time hack. If we're not back on this net in 90 minutes, you call it in as a full recovery, not a rescue, Duval said. The pilot didn't like the distinction. Duval didn't explain it further and led her team down into the dark. The stairwell dropped further than any of them expected, 3 flights becoming 5, the air growing colder rather than warmer as they descended, which Cade flagged immediately as wrong. Emergency lighting flickered to life on motion, decades-old bulbs somehow still wired to a working circuit no one had authorized. Halfway down, the stairwell passed a landing stacked with rusted filing cabinets. Drawers pried open and emptied, papers long since dissolved into the standing damp. One cabinet door hung from a single bent hinge, dented inward from what looked like a single tremendous blow rather than decades of rust. Nobody stopped to read what little paper remained. At the bottom, a corridor stretched in both directions, flooded ankle-deep with black water reflecting the red emergency strips. A heavy blast door at the far end stood half open, its edges scored with long parallel gouges too wide to be tool marks. Okafor knelt by the gouges, measuring them against his glove. "Claws," he said quietly. "Big ones." A few meters further, half submerged against the corridor wall, they passed a stack of ration crates stamped with a supply code that predated the base's official closure by 2 years. Crates that should never have existed if the facility had shut down when the record said it did. Thorne towed one open with his boot. Empty, but recently emptied, the seal broken from the inside. That was when Cade's readout contradicted the motion sensors for the first time, and none of them liked the answer. They pressed forward anyway, because the recorder's locator beacon was still pinging, faint but steady, somewhere deeper in the complex. Thorne took point with his weapon raised, helmet display casting a thin green wash across the flooded floor. Anand stayed pressed close to Okafor, her hard case clutched against her chest like it might protect her from something worse than cold. At the edge of a collapsed barracks doorway, someone had once painted a warning directly onto the concrete in block letters, half scoured by decades of damp. "Do not restore power. Let the horizon stay null." No unit designation, no date, just the sentence, and beneath it a second hand had scratched a tally of short vertical lines too numerous for Duval to count in passing. 200 meters in, the corridor forked. Cade's sensor pinged the beacon down the left passage. The motion detector, at the exact same moment, registered 4 signatures converging from the right. "That's not possible," Cade said, and for the first time his voice cracked. Duval made the call fast, weighing the contradiction for less than 2 seconds before deciding the beacon was worth more than a reading she already suspected the station itself was interfering with. Left passage, toward the beacon, weapons ready on the right flank the entire way. They moved in a tight staggered wedge, boots splashing through frigid water, every breath fogging thick in beams of tactical light. The left passage opened into what had once been a communications room, banks of dead consoles lining the walls, one screen still faintly glowing with the station clock frozen at a time no one could explain. The recorder's beacon pulsed from somewhere behind the console bank, close now, almost within reach. Behind them, the massive blast door they'd passed through minutes earlier groaned on unseen hinges and slammed shut with a sound like a gunshot. No one had touched it. Duval spun first, weapon up, and found the door sealed tight, its manual release while spinning uselessly in Thorne's gloved hands. "It's not stuck," he said. "It's been rewired from the inside. Someone crossed the circuit on purpose." Anand's breath caught, loud enough that Okafor noticed. "Someone or something with hands," Duval said, watching the scientist's face for a reaction she didn't get. Duval keyed her radio toward the surface twice, then a third time. Nothing came back but static chewed thin by hundreds of meters of frozen rock. Whatever channel the pilot had promised to hold, it wasn't reaching them anymore, and for the first time since the insertion, the team was well and truly alone. Cade's sensor screamed a fresh contradiction. The room registered as empty on thermal, yet his handheld secondary passive array picked up a heartbeat rhythm bleeding through the wall behind the console bank, slow and enormous. Nothing human about its cadence. "We're not alone down here," he said. "We were never alone down here." The beacon's ping grew louder, drawing them past the console bank toward a service hatch half-hidden by fallen ceiling tile. Duval pried it open herself, flashlight sweeping across a narrow crawl space that led into darkness deeper than any map suggested this station should have. The crawl space narrowed further with every meter, forcing them into single file, weapons useless in the tight confines, until it finally opened into a low chamber that hadn't appeared on any schematic Cade carried. They found the recorder 11 meters in, resting deliberately on a flat stone shelf as if placed there rather than dragged, its casing scored with the same claw marks from the blast door. Beside it, arranged with unsettling care, sat a row of small bones too clean to belong to any Arctic animal native to the island. "Human," Okafor said, and didn't need to say more. Beside the bones lay a scrap of fabric, sun-faded but still recognizably a uniform patch, a unit designation none of them recognized, and a name taped too corroded to read. Anand looked away from it fast enough that Duval filed the reaction alongside every other answer the scientists still owed them. That was when the amber light bloomed at the far end of the crawl space, 2 points at first, then 6 more behind them, pulsing in an unsynchronized rhythm that made every soldier's night vision bloom and static over at once. "Eyes on!" Thorne shouted, ripping his NVGs off just before they whited out completely, half-blind for the 3 critical seconds that mattered most. The pack didn't charge. It closed the distance with terrible patience, forelimbs digitigrade and silent against stone, fur-sheathed skulls low and level, amber eyes pulsing faster and more erratically than anything centered and steady. Behind them, larger, darker-coated, moving with a heavier and more deliberate stride, came the one Duval's team would later learn had a designation: BOREAS. Duval opened fire first, controlled bursts aimed center mass, and watched rounds punch into fur-covered muscle without dropping a single pack member. "Center mass isn't working." "Cartilage plating," Okafor called back, already dragging Anand toward the wider chamber behind them. "Go for the joints, the throat, anywhere soft." Thorne adjusted fire on the nearest pack member, walking rounds down from the reinforced chest toward the forelimb joint, and watched it stumble for the first time, a snarl replacing the silence it had hunted with until then. It wasn't a kill. It bought them a doorway, and for the moment that was worth more than a body count. BOREAS opened its jaw and released a vocalization pitched below anything human hearing should register. A bone-deep infrasonic pulse that cracked the glass face of 2 dead console monitors and dropped Thorne to his knees, blood threading from one ear. Cade staggered, vision swimming, his sensor tablet slipping from numb fingers to shatter on the flooded floor. Duval counted signatures moving along the chamber's flanks, splitting deliberately into 2 elements, one holding position at the only clear exit while the other advanced, a maneuver she recognized from her own team's training manuals rather than any nature documentary. Whatever Winterkin had built, it hadn't forgotten its doctrine. This was the midpoint no one had planned for. Half their equipment down, half their team compromised, and the recorder they'd come for now feeling like the least important object in the room. Duval hauled Thorne upright by his collar and half-dragged him back through the service hatch, Okafor covering their retreat with controlled shots that bought seconds rather than distance. Cade, still half-deaf and fumbling, popped a thermite stick against the crawlspace mouth behind them, the flare catching wet stone alight in a hissing white burn that bought a few extra seconds of separation but did nothing to slow the pack's pursuit through the wider corridor beyond. The pack didn't rush the kill. It herded, cutting off the direct route back to the blast door, forcing the team deeper into the complex instead. "They're not hunting like animals," Duval said, breathless. "They're hunting like an infantry squad." Anand finally broke. "Because they were trained like one," she said, voice raw. "Project WINTERKIN, 1987. I wasn't cleared to tell you the target profile, only the recovery protocol. I'm sorry. Duval didn't have room for anger yet. Trained for what? Cold weather biological augmentation, Anand said. Soldiers, not animals. Something went wrong in the third trial cohort. The program was supposed to have ended in a controlled burn in 1989. It didn't. There were 22 names on the roster, she added, quieter now, as if the number itself was classified. The after-action report says 22 remains were recovered from the burn. Nobody in my department has ever explained why the recovered remains only accounted for 16. The revelation landed like a second infrasonic blow, and somewhere behind them Cade's voice rose in confusion, disoriented, insisting he'd only just checked his watch and 11 minutes had vanished from his memory that he could not account for. Thorne turned on him, half-deaf, and rattled himself, demanding to know if Cade had been bitten, scratched, exposed to anything during the gap. Cade had no answer, only the same blank stretch of missing time and a growing certainty that whatever had taken it from him hadn't needed to leave a mark to prove it had been close enough to. I don't remember the hatch, he said, staring at his own hands. I don't remember getting here. Okafor grabbed Cade's wrist, checked his pulse against his own watch, and found nothing physically wrong beyond exhaustion and shock. Pupils are even. He's not concussed. Okafor called ahead to Duval. Whatever took the time from him, it isn't in his body anymore. Duval filed the memory gap away as a problem for later, because ahead of them, dimly lit by a single working emergency strip, stood a reinforced door marked in faded stencil. Medical decontamination. It was the only door on this level still sealed from the outside, the only room that might actually hold. They ran for it as Boreas's second infrasonic call rolled down the corridor behind them, closer now, and unmistakably answered by 3 more voices from directions they hadn't yet explored. The decontamination chamber's blast-rated door sealed behind them with a hiss of tired hydraulics, and for a moment the 5 of them simply breathed, Thorne pressing a field dressing to his bleeding ear, Cade staring at his own trembling hands, Anand sliding down the wall to sit on the flooded floor, her hard case finally, uselessly open in her lap. Inside it, not documents, but a single vial, frozen solid, labeled in handwriting decades old. This is why they sent me, Anand said quietly. Not to help you, to recover the last surviving sample before you destroyed anything down here by accident. Duval took the vial without asking permission and slid it into a lead-lined pouch on her own vest. It travels with the mission now, not with you. Okafor finished packing Thorne's ear with sterile gauze and checked his pupils by penlight, satisfied enough to move on but not enough to stop watching him. Thorne waved off further attention, insisting he could still hear commands even if music was a lost cause for a while, a joke that landed flatter than he wanted it to in the reddish half-light of the chamber. Outside the door, the corridor had gone eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that made Cade's remaining sensor twitch with something worse than silence. Then, through the room's old intercom speaker, the recorder's locator beacon began to ping again, clear and rhythmic, exactly the tone they'd been tracking for hours. Except the recorder itself sat sealed in Okafor's pack, silent, powered down. The pack had learned the signal by listening to them chase it, and was now playing it back through the base's own speaker system to draw them back out. Do not open that door, Cade said, and for once no one argued with him. Cade tried the radio anyway, cycling through every frequency the squadron carried, chasing even a single burst of static that might mean the surface still remembered they existed. Nothing answered but the recorded beacon looping through the hallway speaker, patient and indifferent, exactly as if it had learned that patience worked better than force. They held position through what felt like an hour, rationing light, listening to claws test the seams of the blast door in slow, patient scrapes. Okafor worked on Thorne's ear by feel, murmuring statistics about hearing recovery that even he didn't seem to believe. Duval ran the numbers on ammunition, air, and the growing certainty that extraction wasn't coming until they moved themselves. Twice more the door groaned under testing pressure from the far side, patient rather than frantic, the sound of something confirming the seal rather than trying to break it, which somehow felt worse than an outright assault. It was Anand who finally spoke the sentence that reframed everything. The 1989 burn order wasn't meant to kill the cohort, she said. It was meant to bury proof that Command authorized live testing on volunteers who were never told what they'd volunteered for. Boreas isn't a monster that escaped confinement. He's the last surviving witness to what this base actually did. No one answered her. There wasn't an answer that made the next decision easier. Duval laid out the last of their equipment on the flooded floor: 2 thermite sticks, a dwindling battery reserve, and Cade's 1 working sensor unit. Okafor argued for waiting out the pack's patience. Thorn, half-deaf and blunt about it, argued that patience was a luxury they didn't have air or ammunition to afford. Duval listened to both, then made the call herself the way Command always eventually had to. Anand asked, quietly, if they intended to leave the vial behind as a bargaining measure. Duval's answer was immediate and final. Nothing that had cost this much stayed in that bunker, whatever Boreas believed he was owed. Duval made the call: 1 exit, through the flooded corridor, back toward the stairwell, using the last working thermal on Cade's undamaged secondary unit to track the true gaps between pack positions instead of trusting a single contradicted reading. It was the only plan built on doubting their own instruments equally in both directions. They moved in a tight column, Thorn half-deaf but still sighting true, Okafor covering the rear, Anand boxed protectively in the center for the first time since the mission began. Boreas met them at the console room threshold. Alone, the pack notably absent, amber eyes holding steady in that slow dominant pulse that marked him apart from every subordinate they'd faced. He didn't attack immediately. He watched Anand's hand rise instinctively toward the lead pouch on Duval's vest, and something in his posture shifted, lower, more deliberate, less predator and more mourner. He recognizes it, Anand whispered. The sample. He knows what it is. For a long moment nobody fired, and Boreas didn't close the distance. The two sides frozen across the flooded console room in a standoff neither training nor protocol had prepared any of them for. Duval's fingers stayed on the trigger, but for one held breath she understood, with total clarity, that the creature in front of her was choosing not to attack. Duval didn't wait to find out what that recognition meant. She gave the order, and the team opened fire together, aiming low for joints and throat exactly as Okafor had called it, rounds finally finding purchase where cartilage plating gave way to softer tissue. Boreas staggered, roared once at an infrasonic pitch that dropped every remaining console screen to shattering static, and retreated deeper into the dark rather than pressing the advantage he clearly still held. Duval didn't chase the retreat. Standing over the ground, Boreas had given up. She understood, without being able to explain it to anyone at debrief, that they hadn't won a fight. They had simply been allowed to leave. Halfway up the first flight, 2 pack members broke from a side corridor to cut across their path, amber eyes flaring in the stairwell's gloom. Duval and Thorn fired together, dropping one with a throat shot that finally found true purchase, while the second peeled off rather than press an attack against a stairwell too narrow to use its numbers. Nobody stopped moving long enough to confirm the kill. They ran the final 200 meters without looking back, up 5 flights of stairs that felt endless, out through the hangar's open door into blinding Aleutian daylight and the descending thunder of their extraction helicopter. Only aboard the aircraft, altitude climbing, did Cade's secondary thermal unit, the one they'd trusted over everything else, finally sink its delayed buffer and display a final, uncorrected readout from the console room. 5 heat signatures retreating up the stairwell, and 6 still holding position below. Nobody could explain the extra signature. Nobody on that flight tried. Duval stared at the frozen readout until the pilot asked, twice, whether she was cleared to talk about what had happened below. She wasn't, and for once she was almost grateful for the excuse. Nobody could explain the extra signature. Nobody on that flight tried. Duval stared at the frozen readout until the pilot asked, twice, whether she was cleared to talk about what had happened below. She wasn't, and for once she was almost grateful for the excuse. Dr. Priya Anand was reassigned within 72 hours to a facility whose name never made it into anyone's after-action file. Cade's missing 11 minutes were never medically explained, logged instead under a fatigue code that satisfied nobody who had been in that console room. And somewhere beneath the frost line of an island most maps don't bother naming, the horizon stayed exactly where the last technician's warning said it should, null and listening. The mission closed with the sample recovered and the base resealed, but the true cost wasn't measured in casualties. It was measured in the 6 signature nobody could account for on the climb back to daylight. Command's official file says the matter is closed. The uncorrected sensor buffer says otherwise, and it has never been explained. Subscribe to The World Behind Midnight to uncover the next operation before it disappears, because some secrets are best left behind midnight.